Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another collaboration between Pondering Soul and Darwinian Delusions. And what else are we going to talk about today except nihilism? Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah, I'm good. Not bad. How are you?
Very well. Alhamdulillah. So, why are we doing this topic? Well, if you guys remember, we had a series in which we were covering Yusuf's dissertation. And we got to around maybe past the midway point. I think we did.
I think you've got your. There's an echo. Have you got a channel open already? Oh, it was me. Yeah, it was me, sir.
Okay. So basically, we were doing the dissertation, and I posted it in the comments for anybody who wants to go through it as we're going through it. And we're going to go through part 3. Is that right?
Yeah. It's the final part of. It's the 3-part dissertation.
Yeah.
In the past, we did part 1 and part 2, which is what is nihilism, the leap of faith, and this all leads up to now. How should we respond to nihilism?
Yeah. And then just a quick recap for why we're covering this particular topic. I did a Dawah training course for the brothers in Australia today, the UMA Street Dawah Sydney guys. And I gave them the example from Call of Duty Warzone, which I haven't managed to play, but I watch a lot of YouTube video clips of people basically playing it. And they got this weapon called the Joker, right? Which is like a javelin missile. And it's like, amazing. And that's how I described when I was doing the Dawah training course. I said, guys, if you wanted the Joker weapon, right? If you want that against atheism, it's actually nihilism, because it's whatever they're saying. They literally could be saying, isn't it true that in your religion you have this? Or they could be saying literally anything. And you could just say, well, why does it matter anyway? At any point. So it's like the ultimate weapon. And that's why I'm super keen to hear what we have today. Basically, which is, what was the name of the section again?
It's how should we respond today, in particular to nihilism?
Yeah.
So, what can you hear me loud enough? Do I need to turn the gain up? Or is
perfectly well, yeah.
Okay, so just to kind of recap what we went over. So the first section explains what nihilism is. So it's just this overwhelming sense of meaninglessness that people have. And that this is a result of what Nietzsche in particular refers to as the death of God. And the death of God, he didn't mean it in any literal sense. He meant it simply in the fact the loss of faith in Europe in particular. And then just the consequences of that. He saw himself as the first nihilist, but not the last. His prediction was that Europe was moving into nihilism, and that it was an inevitable movement. It was going to happen, and it basically was transforming Christianity into science. And so he never saw science as like this kind of competing entity that appeared to spite Christianity, but he saw it as the corpse of Christianity, so to speak. And the reason he says that is because the scientific community still hold particular values that they inherited in Europe from the Christian moral system. And we're going to go into these in a bit more detail. Part 2 was talking specifically about the leap of faith and about the necessity of the leap of faith. And the reasons I kind of push towards saying that leaps of faith are necessary is linked to us being finite. And so I show a comparison between 2 philosophers. One was Kierkegaard, who was, I think he was Danish philosopher, who was Christian, who in his book talks about the night of faith and leaps of faith. And he kind of makes this expression, it feels like he was sort of the father of this absurdism. Like life is absurd. Everything is absurd. And his kind of fix to that is that you just have to make leaps of faith because of this absurdity, that you can't escape it. That you're just constantly faced with paradoxes and contradictions and tangents and madness. And the only way out of that, for him in particular, obviously because he was a Christian, it was a leap of faith into Christianity. Sorry, my phone dropped. And And then I moved on to discussing Albert Camus.
Yeah. So just a quick question on that, Yusuf.
Yeah.
So when Nietzsche is mentioning Christianity as the science as a corpse of Christianity, in the sense that it holds on to certain values that Christianity, it's like a hangover of Christianity, essentially. Is this in reference to things like values of the sanctity of human life, and like studying nature is part of, like understanding God and this type of stuff, or
Understanding God's creation, yeah. Well, the main drive was the will to truth, and so
what is that?
the will to truth is basically that truth is one of the highest values.
Oh, yes.
And that there is a reason to move towards it. And in part 3, I'll start to begin to go into this a little bit, because this kind of does recap. But just to kind of conclude, I talk about Albert Camus, who is a nihilist, and he also believes, not in the exact same way as Kierkegaard, but he believes everything's absurd. That any kind of study into philosophy leads to this nihilism. What's the point? And everything, like everything just leads to contradictions and paradoxes and confusion. And then he even starts to refer to a discussion with like a scientist talking about the atom. And we did this in our talk about science is art. I make mention of Camus' particular point here, that the scientist is forced to move into the realm of metaphor. That is to try to describe the truth with the lie, which is what a metaphor is. It's use something that isn't related but in somehow connected to try to get you to understand that. And so I move through Camus' philosophy to kind of show there's a point where he starts to critique Kierkegaard, and he's critiquing in particular Kierkegaard's notion of the leap of faith. And in that section, and if you watch the previous episodes I've done with Sabor on nihilism, or on my dissertation, in part 2, I show how even when he's critiquing Kierkegaard's leap of faith, he's making leap of faiths in that critique, and he's diminishing this idea of a leap of faith, and he hasn't noticed what it looks like anyway. He hasn't noticed the implicit leaps of faith he's made in his coming to the conclusions he did. And then even like I've spoken to this about Imran as well, like towards the end of his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, he kind of leads you down this very depressing, dark rabbit hole into nihilism. And then at the end, he just yanks it back up. But he does it with a lot of rhetoric. He does it with a lot of moving speech. But it's not necessarily convincing why you should do that. And the whole purpose of his that essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, it was to explore the question of why not just commit suicide? Why not just end life if it's all absurd, if there's no point to it?
Yeah, and you know about when he denied the leap of faith, right? And he's basically I don't remember exactly your words, but well, Kierkegaard considered Abraham the knight of faith, right? And he considered him to be like an ideal. Now, do you think that time, him denying faith, right? Which was when was this? Camus, he was World War II. That was a time, and the question seems a bit tangential, but there's a reason I'm asking. So the logical positivists, they were really popular during the 20s and the 30s, right? The Vienna Circle and the Austria Circle, and faith was obviously, even before that, it was seen as something bad. But do you think Camus was living in an environment where the background was kind of like, don't talk about faith, or anything that's faith-based and not science-based or reason-based is like nonsense?
Well, I think this was mainly in the academia circles. The general populace, I think they didn't really follow in pursuit with this kind of nihilistic way of life. Not until maybe it started happening, maybe around like more widespread. I would say in the 60s, where like this whole rebellion attitude started to kind of develop. But before then, this is something I'm going to have to look into a bit more, I think, because and I'm just kind of speaking off intuition here in this regard. But I get the feeling that the general populace was still very somewhat traditional, religious. You know, that going to church was still not necessarily frowned upon. But you know, but the opposite was frowned upon. And maybe you could say that, you know, even in the 20s and 30s, the general academia, and I guess it depends on where you were as well. Because in France, this kind of atheist philosophy was really becoming more popularized. But it's an interesting thing to think about, I guess. It's an interesting question. So maybe if I look into that a bit more at that point, I could maybe say a bit more into it. But kind of moving back to the essay, so I kind of, in part, to conclude, to show the necessity of a leap of faith, that this is based on the fact that we're finite, that there's always missing information, and that these decisions, sometimes you're forced to have to make a decision. You're forced to have to pick between A or B, and not picking is itself still forcing one of the two choices. So if you don't do anything, that's still kind of inclining to one of the two positions, or three or four, however many there are. And so you do in life, as you're moving forward, you know, we don't live in this kind of ideal philosophy world where you can just kind of sit in an armchair, think of a, you know, for example, a really good example of that was the trolley problem.
Yep.
And you know that, so they talk about the fact that, oh well, if you're on a track and there's a split in the track, and on one side there's one person tied to it, and on the other side there's four, and you have access to the lever. If you pull the lever, you kill one person. If you don't touch it, you kill four. And it's like, what would you do? And you can, if you ever have a look at what people answer to this, the answers are very varied, and people go in depth as to why they would act the way they would. And I'm never convinced that people would actually act the way that they say they would act. Because when you are forced to act in a situation like that, you don't have time to think. You don't have time to wonder what you would do. Some people get shocked from the pressure and they freeze. You know, there's all sorts of things. You've just got a limited amount of time. You've got to act. You've got to do something. And this is life. Life is, you don't have the opportunity necessarily to sit and to think about all these things. You have to act ad hoc. You have to act on the go. And with limited information, and with like not necessarily understanding the mechanics of everything. And so even when it comes to all of these debates, when you're looking at, even say like Kierkegaard was one who moved in this position where he was saying, when you're looking at the arguments to or against, you know, for so on and so forth, to do with God, there's always objections, and these objections don't necessarily, with regards to God, prove that God doesn't exist. Just simply because you, like, say for example, if I put an argument forward in favor of God's existence, if you prove that argument is like unsound or not valid, that doesn't show that God doesn't exist. All you've shown is that I've been really bad at putting an argument together. I could argue really badly about the existence of an egg sandwich in my kitchen. You know, I could reason like very terribly, but that doesn't say that there isn't one. It doesn't say that my wife hasn't actually made it just because I didn't reason it very well. The same thing with God. And when it comes to like the arguments against God's existence, you know, there's always issues with these things. And when you look into a lot of the arguments, there's constantly massive layers of discussion that go into it. There's an objection to the objection, or multiple objections to the objections. And to say that in order to be rational, I would say you would have to look into every single objection and to look into them all and to make sure you've covered every single ground. People don't have the time for that. The general populace definitely don't have the time for that. And philosophers, even they have to specialize on one particular thing. And, you know, they hone in on a particular area of philosophy, and they spend decades or whatever just reading into this one particular subject, trying to get their head around it. And then relying on the testimony of people who've kind of become experts in other fields. And so a lot of the time, these discussions, it's just a kind of a show. You know, on both sides of the apologetics, it's a lot of it's rhetoric, and trying to convince people via these kind of means. And so when you're watching these things, you incline to certain things, and it's not really clear why you move in the directions you move in. And so this is what like Kierkegaard, Camus would refer to as the absurd. It's just life is overwhelming. There's mass amounts of information, and it's hard to process all of that. It's hard to deal with it when it's coming at you full on. And then this is what gives rise to this feeling of nihilism, this feeling of meaninglessness, because you're unable to process all of that information. And this touches on the discussion. I left a question on your stream with EF Dawa yesterday about randomness.
Oh, randomness, yeah. Also, I just wanted to interject there and just I thought of an objection which they normally try and come up with, which is, no. When it comes to science or something else, we're working on eliminating all the possibilities. But even conceptually, even if you get rid of, say, 50 contentions to a particular point or whatever, the problem of underdetermination, or how it was developed into the problem of unconceived alternatives, that basically means anything. There's always going to be something that's unconceived, always something that's beyond you. So going back to the trolley example, a scientist has to make a choice, whether it's theory A or theory B, right? And the atheist may try and say, we're not using faith, we're just going with, what we have, right? Or we're agnostic about it. But the thing is that in the same way with the trolley problem, you either go with A or B, or if you don't go with an answer, you're still going with an answer. Yeah. If you don't pull the lever, you're still basically taking a decision, right?
Yeah.
And you're taking consequences. So faith, because of the problem of underdetermination, problem of unconceived alternatives, is inevitable. It's not about you having enough time to deal with every contention. It's just conceptually inevitable.
Yeah, and this is also why I argue that atheism is a position, although they argue it's not. The rejection of positions is still the movement in a direction. You've got a number of choices. You're still making a choice, and then in that sense, it comes with consequences, and it's often spoke about as a kind of void, and nature abhors a void. They fill it with things, and so like it is a movement in a direction, and then it does extrapolate in many different ways because it's simply a void. Trying to pin them down becomes quite chaotic. But you can still define chaos. You can still look at it and say, well, they share this particular feature, despite it being hard to kind of pin down completely. So I move on to that and argue in favor of this, the necessity of leaps of faith. And this isn't and I constantly need to re-stress this because people often try to make the claim that this is somehow anti-rationalist. And that's not the claim at all. Because reason itself has guided us to this conclusion. This isn't the wholesale rejection of reason, because I'm not an advocate of nihilism, and the wholesale rejection of reason is definitely moving in that direction. I'm trying to move you away from it. So reason is important. Don't neglect it. And reason is really useful in terms of guiding you to your horizon, guiding you to your limits. And with regards to, for example, you were talking about science when they're making discoveries and making choices and they're moving through things. They're never going to completely have the full picture, because and you can see this at the moment. Right now, I'm reading a book called Nihilism and Technology by Nolan Gertz, and he in this book is making the argument that technology is facilitating our nihilism. Technology is a form of self-hypnosis. It's a way to escape reality, so that we don't have to deal or bear the burden of being conscious.
So, sorry, is that book by Realms of Meaning, something Phoenix?
No, this is a different book. Realms of Meaning is over there somewhere.
That you quote in your
so that's Realms of Meaning. That's a really, really old book. It's like 50s or something.
Wow. When I was reading the parts that you highlighted in the dissertation, I thought it was written like a few years ago.
No, it was written.
Information and all of that stuff.
Didn't say. I'm sure it did. 1968. This was in the library at 1968.
Wow.
Copyright was 1964, so it's from the 60s.
Interesting.
And it's specifically on a philosophy of the curriculum for general education. So it had a weird purpose, but it ended up really linking into this. But yeah, so Nylon Technology by Nolan Gertz is a newer book. The author's on Twitter, so that's how new it is. But and yeah, and so in this he's talking about technology having these issues as well, and also technology shaping the way we view the world, not necessarily because of like these evil people trying to feed you fake news and things like that, but because we're not considering the fact that technology is itself produced by beings with a bias, and that they might be implementing a bias into the things that they make unconsciously. And then when you use their technologies, that it's closing things in the world down for you, and you're not even noticing it.
Yeah.
And he also points out to another issue in that we can only reflect on things that we realize are a problem. And see, you have these techno utopians that feel as if technology is like some sort of freeing thing, and we shouldn't be pessimistic about it in any way. We should just adopt it and move towards more technology, more and more and more and more, and no questioning it. But the thing is this techno utopian kind of mentality sees life as a problem that needs to be solved, and technology is a way of solving these problems. And what it does is you produce technology, it removes problems from, because obviously if they're not there, you're not going to think about them, and if you're not thinking about them, you're not reflecting on them. But these problems might be very much integral to what it means to be a human being. Yeah. And the problems aren't gone, they're only hidden by technology, because we're not having to deal with them anymore. And so yeah, basically, we're not necessarily moving in a good direction here. We're becoming very reliant on technology. This technology is concealing a number of things about the human being, and despite that, we're moving through time, and the horizon might be moving, but there's always things beyond the horizon, and science isn't ever going to be able to completely encompass all of that. And also with technology, we're just mining all this information, and we've kind of turned it into a resource to be stockpiled, and we've somehow correlated that with being wise for some reason. And it's not necessarily the case that simply having information means that you understand the implications of that information. It just means you've got it on a computer somewhere, reserved. And the more information you have, and not necessarily having the ability to compute or to process that information, this itself facilitates nihilism even more. And so we might have all of this info. We might have all these books with all of these findings in them, but that doesn't. It doesn't follow from that we know what any of this means.
Yeah.
It doesn't follow from that we understand the implications of it all, or that we ever can. That we've not set ourselves an impossible task. And another way of thinking of this is to look at the fact that from this kind of materialistic perspective, anti-supernatural, there's nothing but the physical realm. You have this really complex structure, which is the brain, which produces this experience of consciousness. The conscious being relies on this complex structure. And then when it turns its gaze upon itself, so when the mind turns its eyes upon the mind, it can't comprehend itself. It's too complex. So what it does is it has to create computers and algorithms, which itself it doesn't fully understand how they work. It just understands that, it puts in a number of things, and then they get they get information out of it, but they don't understand necessarily how that entire thing works. So the brain that's so complicated that the mind itself can't understand produces things that are so complicated that it can't understand in order for them to tell it about the brain and help it understand that. And so it's really weird, and it's not 100% clear that this isn't just a really absurd goal. Like there's all these things that
and it's definitely progress. We keep thinking the more circuits we have within our life, within our personal interaction, the more of this technology, we're just getting better, and that is not self-evident. It's not clear why that's the case.
This is also what Nolan Gertz is trying to cover in this. I think he's kind of leaning on Nietzsche a bit here, but not just to talk about or just assume that we're making progress, but to ask what progress is exactly. And generally, progress is whatever the particular people are defining as progress. But that doesn't mean that what they're progressing towards is what's best for them. I think I said this before. You could be progressing towards the center of a volcano. You could be moving towards like land that's weak and could collapse underneath you and take you in with it. And so this might very well be what we're doing. We're moving in a direction which makes us hyper dependent on the things that we're creating. We've not really asked what the consequences of this will be, and we think simply advancing as much as possible is in itself a good. And we've not stopped to pause and think, hold on a second, are we not like a teenage kid here that's just got a brand new car and thought, I'm going to just put my foot down without practicing how to do this incrementally? Maybe I should work my way up to such a speed rather than just go full on without any experience, which is what we're doing. The technology is advancing exponentially.
Yeah,
we're guinea pigs at the moment in this society. We don't know what's going to happen.
And on that point, I just want to add that going back to the movies from the 80s and the 70s and so on, there was always this thing that in the year 2000, in the year 2010, you'll be interacting with technology, and that was seen as a really good thing, right? And I just want to highlight one example, which I myself just find a little bit painful. Yeah. So we obviously are around the same age, right? We're born in like the 80s. So we remember a time when there was no such thing as scanners, right? You used to go to your local shop and they took a product and they gave you a price and you went to your local corner shop, right? And every day that you went, you needed to grab something. You were going to have a little chat, right? How are you? How's this? And in a way, it was kind of like, by the way, what happened on the street today, right? So it was kind of like a Facebook thing. It was our Facebook. Then what happened is, as soon as we started getting this thing about more, cheaper products. So then these small Tesco and Sainsbury's and these places started opening up, and corner shops basically started finishing. Then the interaction became less personal with one person that's like scanning your products and they're in a hurry, they can't talk to you. And we previously thought that was a great thing. You have this machinery. Then they got rid of that person, and then you have to serve yourself and you don't talk to anybody, right?
But yeah, it's about efficiency, isn't it?
Yeah. But I actually, when I go to the shop and I pick up a product and I scan it myself and there's nobody to talk to, right? I'm thinking, how on earth is this progress? Because let's put on our utilitarian hat. My pleasure, right, of talking to another human being, just, how are you? How's everything? This, that, is being replaced by a machine that I have to pick up the stuff myself, and nobody's talking to each other in the shop, and they walk out. And having these machines increases inequality, because Tesco and these companies, they have to give, it's much cheaper to have machines than have people, right? So we don't think about these consequences, but these are real consequences. And soon, inshallah, just to add something which just came to mind, there's a professor at IB Karachi, which is one of the best universities in Pakistan, and she did her PhD in Australia in philosophy of science, so some basic issues. And basically, she's written an entire book about technology and nihilism, and technology and its purpose within Islam. That technology is with a purpose; it's not just purposeless. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, we're not having that discussion enough. That having more electronics around you does not mean we're progressing as a society.
No, I agree. And he even touches on this a bit in the book Known Gertz, where he's talking about like we're creating things for the sake of efficiency.
Yeah.
But the issue is this kind of makes the consumer obsolete, or it gets rid of the workforce. And we're not really thinking, well, at what point, if technology is successful and frees everyone from work, where are they going to gain capital to... and it's slowly, people kind of, you could refer to it as a slippery slope fallacy, but people have always been complaining about it. But we're kind of moving in the direction where it feels as if technology at some point will kind of get rid of jobs completely, or to the point where it's like, well, how are people going to start earning or like drawing capital out of the system at this point? But so we're probably best. We've got like half an hour, so we'll go to part 3 of the. That was a very big introduction segue into the actual essay. So I begin part 3 with an introduction to what I'm going to discuss in that. So like, how are we going to respond? And I recap again. So truth and reason were one of like the highest values within Western society, and they still are. But these are moral decisions. You know, that you have to put a value on truth and see that as itself being a moral end in order to pursue it. And what Nietzsche says is basically the reason Christianity undermined itself by making these the highest value is that truth to begin with, prior to that, people were only really concerned with the pleasant life-preserving aspects of truth. And they were actively hostile against truths that were dangerous to life or to society. And this hasn't stopped, by the way, with the scientific community. Like truths themselves are not necessarily good, and they can be quite problematic. So you look at, for example, how the ability to have a heart transplant, how that developed from abhorrent experiments that the Russians did in the Soviet Union by removing dog heads and attaching pumps to their arteries and pumping oxygenated blood through a severed head and messing about with this. And then you can, these videos are on YouTube, by the way. You can look at these experiments and they're only like 1 minute long, and they're not that gory, but they're still very horrific to look at. And you see a head on a table, and it's got a pump attached, and you've got all these pumps coming out of the dog's head, and it's alive. It's just a head. And they're putting citrus on its lips, and it's licking its lips. They're banging on the table, and it's flinching. You know, they're flashing lights in its eyes, and it's blinking. Like the dog's alive, and it's only a head. And then they transferred dog heads to other dog bodies, and they've done this with monkeys. And obviously, this is very questionable, ethically so. But if you can sever science from ethics, you can do a lot of stuff. And you see this as well. A lot with China, they have much less strict ethical rulings than, say, the West. And so the West, they get rightfully very uppity about experiments on animals. In China, they're not as strict with that. And so if companies want to do experiments, they can often basically move to China, where they can get away with doing these kind of things. But that gives them a competitive edge against the other nations that are trying to get power. If you can free science from ethics, you remove obstacles, and you can do abhorrent things and get a benefit from it in the end, which can increase your nation's power. And this is an issue. And so this is a truth, and it can be truth itself derived from any sort of ethical questions. And obviously, if you're going to be hostile to these in a certain way, if you're from the West, but not necessarily so if you're from China. And so these values undermine themselves. And just as reason does, like how do you justify reason without using reason? You've got to use other means in order to do so. And they all give rise to the death of God, which is, as I said before, the metamorphosis of Christianity into modern science, which he refers to as the corpse of Christianity. He also says that this gives rise to the collapse of the distinction between the real world and the apparent world, which came from Plato. Okay. So Plato talks about... Go on.
Just a small point. When you said you need something else other than reason to justify reason, could you just unpack that a little bit before you carry on?
Yeah, so how do you justify reason? So this is the idea that reason as a highest value undermines itself or devalues itself. Because if you're using reason to justify reason, there's something circular here, which goes against what reasonable people would suggest. So this was a critique of Descartes. He justified God by using reason. He justified reason by using God. And they go, circular argument. You can't do that. And so maybe you remove God but then you've still got the issue. Well, how are you justifying reason then? Whatever you're giving is going to be a reasoned argument. So how do you justify reason without using a reasoned argument, or without appealing to reason? You have to appeal to intuition. You have to appeal to some sort of faith in the faculty of reason, which we've again spoke about in another video that we did on the problem with evolutionary reliabilism. If reason is something that evolved with us, that means it's subject to change. And also, if evolution doesn't necessarily favor truth but survivability, then how can you be sure you can even trust your own faculties? And so again, these ideas they're undermining themselves, and they give rise to nihilism. They give rise to the absurd and the not being able to necessarily completely comprehend what's going on in the world. And so he moves on to basically the distinction between the real world and the apparent world. Can also be referred to somewhat as the objective world and the subjective world. Now, Plato, he used to refer to the real world as like this eternal place where the forms existed, and the forms themselves were like never, they didn't have a beginning or end; they just existed eternally, and they were in like this kind of heaven, and this is where the good was. And then you had the world, or the apparent world, which is like a world of shadows, which is this world. And this is where everything is constantly in flux, constantly changing. And this isn't where truth is. But if you use reason, you can guide yourself to the true world, the real world, which is the realm of the forms. And that the apparent world is just basically illusion. And the best description of his idea of this is with the cave simile, or the analogy of the cave, where he talks about a man in a cave that's constantly been showing shadow puppets on a wall, and he thinks the shadow puppets are real. And then someone frees him, and he goes up and he sees the light for the first time, and he sees objects. And that once he's experienced these, he knows that these have more reality than the shadow puppets he was watching. And then when he goes back to try to tell everyone about it, they don't understand, because they've not experienced it, so there's no way of them understanding it, and they just refer to him as crazy. And so that's the real world and the apparent world. But then at some point throughout that history, we've gotten rid of the real world, as Plato saw it, and we've rejected it. And Nietzsche, he basically at that point says that this also gets rid of the apparent world. That once you get rid of one, the distinction of the other dissolves as well. And this again leads to this sort of nihilism. Now, he also, like I've kept stressing, he doesn't see nihilism as a truth in the same sense as like it's not an objective truth. It doesn't mean just because we're experiencing this pathological state of nihilism that life is actually meaningless. It doesn't follow from that. He refers to it as an intermediate pathological state. And so basically it's simply the experience of the thing that can have experiences. It's being overwhelmed by options. It's being overwhelmed by choice, overwhelmed by the burden of consciousness and of freedom. And that it's a transitionary stage into something else. And you have active and passive nihilists. Passive nihilists, it's kind of in the name. They are passive. They just kind of couch potato, and they don't posit themselves in the world. And active nihilists are more destructive. So they'll go out and they'll actively try to destroy other things that try to provide meaning in people's lives. And so the atheist, in that sense, the committed atheist activist, would be an active nihilist. And especially in the sense that they're just constantly going out trying to deconstruct other things without necessarily even offering anything in replacement of it. So yeah, and you can see that we're in that stage. We've moved into what the philosophers are referring to as like a postmodern era, where these postmodern philosophers deny that there's such thing as truth altogether. They deny that there is good and evil. They deny that we even have choice, that free will is an illusion. They deny the self. They're denying pretty much everything. And they're doing it motivated by this kind of overwhelming of things, getting too much. And they're with this as well. They're bastardizing tradition, ancient wisdom, And there's also this weird flipping upside down where the youth become seen as the wise ones, and the elderly become seen as tyrannical and oppressive. And there's a supreme naivety in that somehow the youth know better. And you'll hear this kind of reiterated about politics as well. So they'll talk about, oh well, the vote went in, and the traditionalists seem to have won, but that's not fair because they're going to die soon, and we've got to live in the world that they've given us. And they push it as if it's like, as if they're only doing it to spite the youth. And they're not necessarily doing it because they've been young and they know what it's like to be young and naive and want and desire freedom and want to act on your desires and this, that, and the other. And obviously, as you get older, I think a lot of people, when they reach older age, they generally look back at all of that and see the problem with being dragged around by your passions like a dog on a leash. And this is an issue. Sorry, you look like you were going to say something.
I was, but then I realized, because basically Aaron Ra put up a tweet today about nihilism, which was exactly related to what you were saying. But then I just thought, do you know what? We'll put that right at the end.
Inshallah.
He put up something as a contention to the way that you've explained it here. And of course, he doesn't know what he's talking about because, that's not his field. But I just thought I'd put it to you near the end.
Inshallah. So like I'm just kind of trying to paint this picture about the direction the world is moving, that these issues are real. You can see them. We are having to deal with a postmodern society, especially with kind of the left-wing politics. You see it with the wanting to dissolve distinctions between things. We won't go into specifics about everything that they're trying to dissolve the distinctions between. And you see this kind of the movement towards trying to get the youth to become the powerful, and to just kind of usurp our elders, usurp anyone who is on the brink of moving into death. Now, with that, check my notes. So man is often portrayed as a rational being as well. And this is also implicit in politics, and especially in democracy. We say the human being is born as rational, and for that reason, we should trust them, and not just them, but the majority of them. And this is underpinned. This is an assumption of democracy, that if you give people the ability to make their own choices, that they will pick choices that are necessarily better for them. And that hasn't been shown at all. And I think even modern day politics is kind of proving the opposite. That people can be led off a cliff. They don't even see it coming. And the point in this essay, basically, I'm trying to argue and show that man is not just rational, or the human being is not just a rational being. That they also have, coupled with that, an irrational aspect. And that they're constantly having to deal with that. And the atheist doesn't escape this by denying religion. And the way a lot of them put it as well, becoming religious isn't just an acceptance of being irrational. Being religious is not synonymous with being stupid. And the being rational and irrational is something you find regardless of what camp you're in. You have these elements, whether you're an atheist, you have these elements, even if you're a theist. And also, meaningful engagements are inescapable. Even nihilism is a meaningful way of engaging with the world. And so in this sense, it's a bit of a living contradiction. And this is why, as well, it shouldn't be seen as a truth, but simply as an experience, a subjective experience of the world when overwhelmed with the sheer overabundance of information that's out there, with all of these issues and problems, along with the burden of suffering, and all of that. And so meaning is something that's often neglected, and the reason is because meaning is a subjective thing. And I've pointed this out in previous discussions, how when you are overly objective, you flush meaning out of the way, or you try to anyway, because you see it as sort of an obstacle to finding objective truths. because when you're looking into, say, the world, you're trying to work out gravity. You're trying to work out whether or not dark matter exists and where it is, if it does. Where the black holes are. All of this, it doesn't necessarily matter what the meaning of life is. The meaning is something superfluous to trying to just finding out this information and to just mine it from the universe, to mine it from that. And this is a problem, because what they've done here is they've knocked meaning out of the top of the hierarchy, or they think they have. And when they're practicing science, they drop it. And that is a mistake. Meaning, I'm going to argue in part 3, is something that should be up there at the top. And I'm going to use basically Viktor Frankl as my main reference in order to argue in this direction. And right here as well, the pursuit of truth. The pursuit of truth, it can be mixed with assumptions. And you see this with the atheist. An example would be, so the eventual death of our sun, you could call that an objective fact, that one day the sun will die. Now, if you add with that the assumption that there is no God, then that means the universe is going to, our galaxy is eventually going to end. Life won't be possible there. What's the point then in all of this? Like, if everything's just going to be destroyed in the end, what was the point in doing anything in the first place? But that's only the consequence of mixing truth with an assumption that isn't even necessarily true. And so what happens here is they can think that they talk often as if, no, this is truth, this is an inevitable conclusion. But again, this mixes into the leap of faith, or the necessity of leaps of faith. And there's always a lack of information. You never have anything proved, or not necessarily proved 100%. A lot of things are inductively reasoned towards. You're guided by passions. You can't escape any of this. You're a human being. It's an innate part of you. And to reject this is silly. And so that's kind of the introduction to part 3. And then I move on to the will to meaning and its derivatives. So the will to meaning is a particular thing that Viktor Frankl is saying is the primary, how does he word it exactly? A primary drive of the human being is the will to meaning. And he defines it as the basic striving of a man. Go on.
So Viktor Frankl is obviously quite late. So in terms of philosophers, is sort of Schopenhauer, is he like one of the first people to speak about the will to meaning? Because he speaks
no. Schopenhauer doesn't talk about the will to meaning.
Oh.
Schopenhauer is before Nietzsche. Nietzsche was very much influenced by Schopenhauer.
Right.
And he talks about the world of will.
I think because when I was reading up something Schopenhauer was saying, he was saying that there's a drive towards meaning because of a world full of suffering, and also the fact that we're all mortal and we will die. So that drives human beings. So I thought he was basically saying that we have this will towards meaning.
Schopenhauer his argument was just you should see the world as will. So he's got 2 books on the shelf up there. It's the world is will and representation. His main thing wasn't necessarily meaning. Nietzsche was influenced by him insofar as he turns this from just the world as will, but the will to power. And so like everything boils down to the will to power for Nietzsche. And this also underpins his idea of what the Übermensch is, which is the ultimate individual who embodies the will to power and is like they're a creative being, and they impose their will upon the world, and they do so in a way so that they can experience life meaningfully, but on their own terms, not because of social straitjackets, as he kind of refers to it as. And then Viktor Frankl, so Nietzsche dies, I think, in 1900, and Viktor Frankl lives through the Second World War, and he ends up in Auschwitz. So he ends up in the Jew, and the Nazis kept him there because of that very reason. And he survived it. He lived it from the very beginning. He went through the processes of having to watch everyone around him lose their minds, like being put on the edge of starvation. It got so bad at one point there were people just kind of giving up on life completely. They'd lie down and they'd refuse to eat, they'd refuse to drink, they'd just will their own death. They'd just lose all hope, and no amount of beating them could convince them to get up and do anything. They just gave up on life. And he watched this happening. And he also watched people, despite all of this and despite all of this suffering, he watched people do the opposite. He saw people willing life, and not just that, but like making effort to make life more enjoyable for others, giving the last bit of bread. When he was looking at this, he saw this as an evidence of free will. He says, like, at this point, every one of us had been reduced, like whatever we thought made us who we were. Like, he was a psychologist, and before then he was trying to write a book. And when he got in there, he talks about this process of people don't really understand what's going on, and they don't understand the gravity of the matter. And he didn't either. And he was very annoyed that they were going to take his work off of him because he had it in his pocket. And then eventually he realizes that wasn't even the worst of the issues. And anything that made them an individual was taken away from them to the point where they were all on an equal ground at this point. There was nothing left but just the numbers that were tattooed on their arms. And there wasn't anything distinguishing them other than their will. And did they have a will to survive, or did they have a will to just kind of give up on life? And it's a beautiful book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's a very short book. And he begins basically by describing his whole experience in the camp. And then he moves it on to talking about his philosophies to do with the will to meaning, etc. And so, basically he defines the will to meaning as the basic striving of man to find and fulfill meaning and purpose.
Yep.
And this is an innate part of the human being. It's inescapable. You can't deny this meaning. And if you do, it expresses itself in a destructive way. And so that, that's either in, destructive in the sense of you become destructive to others. Like the school shooters you see in America, they become oppressive, and they push this destructiveness on others forcibly, or it becomes destructive upon oneself, i.e. they become suicidal. And so you can't deny the strive for meaning, and understanding it, understanding this, that there is an innate and inescapable part of the human nature, which is the will to meaning, and that you can't just get rid of this, pretend it doesn't exist. Understanding that is part of the antidote to fighting nihilism. And so there's a little quote here that I'll read. So, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life, and not a secondary rationalization of instinctual drives, like the scientists might try to say. So this meaning is unique and specific in that it must and can be fulfilled by him alone. And then does it achieve a significance which will satisfy his own will to meaning. There are some authors who contend that meaning and values are nothing but defense mechanisms, reaction formations, and sublimations. But as for myself, I would not be willing to live merely for the sake of my defense mechanisms, nor would I be ready to die merely for the sake of my reaction formations. Man, however, is able to live and die for the sake of his ideals and values. And I think this really gets something beautiful across, because human life is centered around ideals and values. And the materialist, they just want to reduce this to electrons firing off in the brain. Yeah. But it's not clear that you can just reduce this to that, or that you even should. And that there's not a neglecting of so many important things to do with being a conscious, living human being, sentient, able to interact with your world. And that in their kind of insistence that these things are, as he describes, just defense mechanisms, reaction formations, etc. That there isn't massive injustice in this. And that, it's something that isn't, that they haven't shown sufficiently that we should see things like this. That they're basing this on a lot of assumptions, i.e. materialism, etc., which haven't been proven. Absolutely. People, they start with that assumption, but it's hardly been shown completely. And this gives rise to problems. And so we're going to go through these. Now, Nietzsche, like I said, he boils everything down in the world to power. The utilitarians boil it down to pleasure, for the conscious human being. Frankl, he's going, no, this is a mistake. We need to boil it down to meaning. And the way he does that is he says that power and pleasure, then they're not goals in and of themselves. They're derivatives of the will to meaning. So they rely on the will to meaning. And if you recognize that and facilitate the will to meaning, then the consequences of that is that you'll experience pleasure as a consequence, as a derivative of the will to meaning, and you'll experience an increase in power as a consequence of the will to meaning. And he says, I'll just read what I wrote here. So his justification. Sorry, go on.
So just on that, could you just repeat that point, because that was quite profound.
So power and pleasure are not goals in and of themselves. They're consequences. They're a derivative of the will to meaning. And if someone has a healthy will to meaning, they'll achieve power as a consequence of that, and they'll achieve pleasures as a consequence of that. But the derivatives, they're not themselves the main goal, and they shouldn't be. And so I write, his justifications for this claim is based on the derivative drives relation to goal achievement in general. For him, power is simply the means to an end, and pleasure or happiness is not an end in itself, but rather the effect of successful meaning fulfillment. And so power is useful for achieving goals. And if you're somewhat misguided and you see power as a goal in and of itself, you end up in this unfulfillable cycle where the goal is power. I need to be powerful. You achieve power. What next? I need to achieve more power. And so you use power to achieve power, and you cannot ever become satisfied with it, because you've become confused and you've not understood that power should be used as a means to achieve something meaningful, not just power in and of itself. And power for the sake of power is pointless. There's no meaning in it. And the same thing can be said with pleasure. If you make pleasure the goal, again, you've got yourself into this unattainable feedback loop where you like, and not just that. What did I write here? I've worded it better. So maybe I can't remember exactly how I worded it, but it's the same. It's the same issue. You can't, if you make it the goal, it becomes more difficult. It's linked to the law of diminishing returns as well, and it's a misguided goal, and it's the consequence of a will to meaning and not itself the end. And both of these, if you make them your goal in and of itself, they don't allow for the feeling of becoming content. Whereas if you have a healthy will to meaning, achieving that can bring forth this feeling of contentment, and you'll get, as a consequence of these, the feeling of pleasure, and also you can use power to achieve the meaning. But the power in itself is only useful insofar as it helps you to achieve meaning. And there's another quote here. So to the European, it's characteristic of the American culture that again and again one is commanded and ordered to be happy. But happy is not pursued. It must enter you, and one must have a reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, however, one becomes happy automatically. As we see, a human being is not one in pursuit of happiness, but rather in search of a reason to become happy. Last but not least, through actualizing the potential meaning inherent and dormant in a given situation. And so this links into this idea of meaning being forced. You can't force meaning. You can't create your own meaning. Like you have to set goals and move towards them, and you can achieve them, and meaning starts to express itself through that achievement. The feeling of being significant. And there's very particular things that give rise to that. And and this is something that we'll talk about we're coming up to an hour now. But when I start going into sections 2, 3, and 4, I go into this idea that it's our destiny to suffer. I go into the discussion of free will determinism. And then last of all, by taking responsibility over yourself and to kind of submit to certain things. And how these all interlink becomes clear towards the end of it. And if you want a spoiler, then just read the essay before then. But just to kind of finish on this as well. So meaning can't be forced, just like genuine laughter can't be forced. You can't command someone to laugh. Like, and if any of you have seen those like fake sitcoms, where you're watching it and you're just dead in the face, and something happens, and then there's like this cue because they want you to kind of understand how you were supposed to feel, and so there's a fake laughter, and they even have the sounds, the signs. Sorry, applaud, everyone laugh, and it feels so fake, like and it's fake, and when you're hearing it, and you're not like, if it's genuinely not funny. Like, there's nothing on there that's hilarious. Why is there that fake laughter? There's a repulsion towards it. And it's the same with meaning. When you try to force meaning, for anyone who kind of watches, like there's Vice documentaries on people that try to convince themselves that they are unicorns. And it's fake. It's a fake meaning. It's not what they've discovered. It's they're trying to create it. And it's it's an actively obvious creative endeavor. That they're trying to live out as though it's a reality, it's bad because they're trying to play pretend while pretending they're not playing pretend. It's really weird, and you can't force laughter on yourself or on another, but you need to be given good reason to laugh. You need good reasons to express that, and it's the same with meaning. You can't force meaning. You need good reasons to experience meaning, and the same with happiness and things like that. And so that's where it is. Sorry, I probably could maybe have expressed that a bit clearer. I feel like it might.
That was, I think, sufficiently clear. It sort of reminded me of a funny clip I saw, I think, yesterday. It was Eminem and Mike Tyson, both looking a lot older than we're used to seeing them. And they were literally just saying this, that, this whole idea of, achieving these things that we've achieved, it's all nonsense that this will give you fulfillment. And that sort of reminded me of, the will to pleasure, essentially, that if there's no meaning underwriting that, then it's just, like you said, you do it, you achieve it, and you're like, wait. Like, this isn't what I expected.
Exactly. If you mind, I'll just, it's probably better worded in my essay.
Sure.
So the thing about the pleasure bit.
Let me repost that as well, by the way, the essay. Just post it.
No problem.
You go on.
So I read that quote before, where it's like, man's search for meaning is his primary motivation in life. And that man is not willing to die merely for the sake of his reaction formations, but he's able to live and even die for the sake of his ideals and values. So that he refers, this is me reading my essay now, so that he refers to primary motivation, he refers to it as the primary motivation is important to note here. Unlike either Nietzsche, who claimed that all activity can be summed up by the will to power, or the utilitarian, who claims that life can be summed up as the pursuit of happiness or pleasure, Frankl considers both of these as mere derivatives of man's primary concern, that is, his will to meaning. His justification for this claim is based on the derivative drive's relation to goal achievement in general. For him, power is simply the means to an end, and pleasure or happiness is not an end in itself, but rather is the effect of successful meaning fulfillment. With regards to the former, power is only useful in terms of its function as a tool in achieving a goal, but becomes misguided when it is made the goal in itself. One seeks power for the sake of, if one seeks power for its own sake, one inevitably gets caught up in a loop that can never be satisfied. The power is used to attain more power, which is then used to attain more power, and so on ad infinitum, until its meaningless becomes apparent. With regards to the latter, when happiness or pleasure themselves are made the goal, rather than being seen as what they truly are, as effects earned in the achievement of a goal, one is again caught in an ultimately unsatisfying cycle of seeking the means to attain pleasure or happiness as a temporary solution to the problem of meaninglessness, while remaining constantly unfulfilled. And so, you see it because they confuse, say, the temporary experience of joy and the happiness that comes with that in that moment, as happiness itself, or as being content. And it isn't. And then obviously that coupled with the law of diminishing returns, every time you find something that gives you momentary joy, when you go to repeat that behavior, the amount of joy it gives you lessens, and the amount you need to take to get anything close to the original feeling ups. You need to up your dosage. Obviously, if you're a finite being with finite resources, that can go on forever until you get to a point where you can't achieve the doses that you need in order to achieve the joy that you're hoping to feel from it. And it becomes meaningless. It becomes dead. It becomes a habit. It becomes an addiction that doesn't even provide you the thing that you started using it to achieve in the first place. And if you keep doing this, you're just attaining habits. You're attaining addictions that are very difficult to get rid of and cause you severe amounts of pain in trying to remove, or you keep them to sustain a normal and then have to move on to something else which you can become addicted to. And you're just collecting addictions that, to begin with, they give you joy, but in the long run, they become pointless. And removing them from your life does the opposite thing that you started doing them in the first place. So that's important to keep in mind. Obviously, like I said,
just wanted you to sort of elaborate on, was it Viktor Frankl who basically said, because of the law of diminishing returns, that can't give you contentment, therefore we have to have this will towards meaning? Or was it?
I don't think he mentions the will of. He might have mentioned the will of diminishing returns. I can't remember. That might have been. I've read that somewhere else.
So his thing, like, what I'm trying to get to is what it was his reason for saying the will to power and the will to pleasure are derivatives and consequences of the will of meaning, not the other way around.
I think his reason for saying it is that it's self-evident when you look at it. And so when you see that people who don't make happiness itself the goal, or who don't make power itself the goal, but have other things which we'll go into that are much more important and also give rise to the sense of significance. And many of these things are to do with kind of what I think anyway, a community-driven, feeling part of something that's bigger than yourself. All of this is involved in that, and it's part of this drive of the will to meaning. And it's why even when you see people rebelling against, say, religion, and that the reasons they give are things like, you're just conforming, you're doing this, you're doing that. It's ironic that when they become atheists, that there's this massive conformity to this secular Western way of life and all of the ideals with that. So there was a really funny documentary in Saudi Arabia, and it's like, oh, this is great, and it's like a very liberal person. It was so cheesy, dude. And they were going on about how free they were, and it's like, this looks like Manchester. What a coinkydink that, like, everything that they're doing that's making them unique, that's making them free and blah, 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 is just a carbon copy of a million things that I've already seen in the West. They're not doing new things. They're just doing it with a turban on. They're doing it with a thobe. Like, it's
Bro,
was hilarious.
Bro, I really think you need to blog that. That's priceless. Like, I saw that documentary and I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. But it's this idea that, because we're rebelling against religion, that we're somehow unique, we're somehow individuals. And you even see this problem. We're not talking here about people that live in a traditional society that are rebelling, but you can see this being expressed in Western societies themselves. It's like everyone is trying so hard to be an individual that trying to stand out so much just makes everyone blend in. If you go into a city centre in London, everyone looks bizarre. No one stands out anymore. Like, it doesn't matter if you've got like pink spiky hair and like you're covered in piercings and things like that. It's when being unique becomes prevalent, becomes common, then no one's unique anymore. If everyone's an individual, if the point is that, like, if in order to be seen as of any worth in this society, you need to make sure that what you're wearing isn't something what everyone else is wearing. You know, like try stand out. You don't stand out. It's a really bizarre phenomenon. So everyone in their attempt to become different becomes the same.
It kind of reminds me of when you were saying that you were on the island and there's all these people dancing and they had like painted faces.
Yeah. They look like a coral. I was on mushrooms at the time as well, and so like I was thinking really abstractly, and I was staring at them, and they were all on this platform. They were all dancing, and they stopped looking like individuals, and they just became this cohesive unit of like look. And I'd just long before that had been diving.
Yeah.
So I was looking at corals, and I was like putting all these.
Honestly, you need to blog this, like this point in particular, because there's obviously a lot of very rich content here. But one thing which I always found absurd was this whole idea that we're unique, right? And this being an avenue for meaning, that okay, okay, everyone's like this, but I'm different. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a reporter, I've forgotten his name, not a reporter, he's like a journalist. And he's in his 70s now, and he's been interviewing people for a very long time. So he has videos on the internet from people in the 80s who are young, and they got like punk rock hair, and they're trying to look different. And all the old people, they're like, oh yeah, I'm never going to be like them. And those people are old today. Do you see? So things just come full circle. That whole idea of we're unique, we're different, and this gives us meaning. It's just simply not true.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't have elements of you that are individual or unique. It's just when you become
Yeah. Can everyone hear Yusuf, because his voice is gone?
And hello?
Yeah, we lost you. We lost. We lost.
Virgin Media is terrible.
Lost.
Okay. So yeah, it's not that you should just completely lose yourself and not be an individual. Like try to remove anything unique about you. It's just this wholesale rejection of conformity is itself absurd. You can't reject something simply of the fact that you share things with people in that thing. Wholesale, it's just ridiculous, because even in that rejection, you're conforming with a group of people that are agreeing with that, and you're following people, and you're likely having been accepting that value system because you've heard someone talk about it and they've inspired you, and you've looked at them as like impressive in some way, and you've wanted to emulate them. Or like follow their example, and because you've been inspired by it, and you want to try and lead other people to accept that value as well. And so like in this thing, there's implicit the very thing that you're trying to stop. You have to use it still. It's inescapable. It's the same with the will to meaning and the leap of faith. These things are innate in the human being.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think we have time for that question that Aaron Ra put, but we can start on that next time, because that's definitely going to take you a bit of time to unpack.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Just remind me of that question.
Yeah.
I'll take a screenshot of it and leave it on my desktop, and then just remind me, and then I'll chuck it in there, because it's obviously important to.
Yeah. Sorry to everyone as well.
Sorry.
Yes. So I just want to apologize for completely neglecting the chat again. It's a weird subject, and it kind of requires me to really focus in on what my notes are saying and try to remember the point of the dissertation, because it's quite a last thing, and it's constantly trying to link this whole thread. Say again?
There weren't that many questions. It was all comments. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
But forgive me. So it's probably best we leave it there as well, because we've gone 15 minutes over your estimated time thing. You said an hour.
It's only because I'm going to go live. Next time we do it, that won't be the issue, because I don't go live twice in a day. I go live once a day. So next time we'll have more time as well. Jazakallah khair as always. And I I did actually put the dissertation in the beginning, and I'm posting it again. Make sure you guys read this, and inshallah, this is something which it may take a year or 2 years, but I'm really trying to push Yusuf to, inshallah, write a book on this, because I believe, like I said in the beginning, this is the Joker weapon. Right? This is at any point in a debate. Like, I feel a lot more confident now that I understand nihilism, and Jazakallah khair for Yusuf for doing that. At any point in the debate, I can just say, well, okay, what's the point? Fine, I'll become an atheist. Well, what should I do? Like, literally at any point, you could just drop it, and they literally do not have an answer. So, Jazakallah khair, and we'll have you again.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Can you pop this in the description box of the video as well? And I'll send you like things like my social media, my dissertation link.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll copy and paste it from the previous videos. I'll do that.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.